This video discusses how to evaluate secondary data. First, I'll go over the uses and classifications of secondary data. Then I'll help you understand the pros and cons of secondary data. And then lastly, we will go over the quality of secondary data and how to critically evaluate that quality. Secondary data, as you know, is data that has been gathered by someone else, an institution, an organization such as a research company or government, and that you could use for your research. Primary data, on the other hand, is data that you collect yourself firsthand for the problem you're studying. There's huge amounts of secondary data available, usually available online, sometimes at a fee, but in many cases there's a lot of information available for free. Secondary data has a wide variety of purposes. For example, governments can collect demographic data, companies can use this demographic data to forecast market size in a new territory or identify new segments. Think of the example of a new business idea for which you want to test the market potential or want to understand what would be a good location, such as the example I gave about solar-powered backyard saunas in one of the previous videos. In those cases, you can rely on demographic data, climate data, and so on, which are all secondary data, to make your decision. Another purpose is political polling or government making policy decisions based on demographic data. For example, what is the population growth in a certain area? How many 5-year-olds will enter the school system in the next year? How many seniors will be eligible for Medicaid in the next decade or so? It also helps people and companies, entities, understand emerging markets and trends, and it can give companies insight into their own performance based on tracking data and internal secondary data. There's two main classifications of secondary data: internal versus external secondary data. Internal secondary data is collected within a company and consists of information such as sales records, purchase requisitions, invoices, and are all part of a company's MIS. External secondary data is data that has been obtained outside of the company, but that can be used by companies for their research purposes. For example, research organizations or government data can be part of external secondary data, but also published sources, syndicated services data, and various external databases. A lot of this data is used for database marketing. Database marketing means that companies maintain and use internal databases, so data they have on their customers, for the purpose of contacting, transacting, and building better customer relationships. Customer relationship management is one of the main reasons why database marketing is done. And a lot of this relies on data mining. Data mining is the process of making sense of huge amounts of data, usually for marketing purposes. It involves aspects of statistics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and virtually any industry right now is based on data and algorithms. The software programs you see on this slide are all examples of data mining software tools that help you make sense of large databases. So companies and governments know a lot about you. Basically, every click on social media, every like of a post, whatever you buy or watch on Netflix, everything gets tracked. Of course, this can raise some ethical issues. When this data is collected consensually, there's no ethical issue, but often these lines are very blurry when it comes to privacy. The Cambridge Analytica/Facebook case is a very good example of this.
In 2014, you may have taken a quiz online, something that looked like this. And if you did, you probably shared your personal data and your friends' personal data with the company that worked for President Trump's 2016 campaign. Here's how it happened. It begins with a research firm, Cambridge Analytica. CA partnered with a UK-based academic, Alexander Kogan, who was using Facebook data for research purposes. Quizzes were sent to around 300,000 Americans. They looked innocuous. Over 100 personality traits to agree or disagree with. And you got paid less than $5. But there was a catch. To take the survey, you had to log into Facebook, which gave Kogan access to your profile, including your birth date, location, and most importantly, your Facebook likes. Kogan combined the quiz results with your Facebook data to develop a psychometric model, a sort of personality profile. He then combined this with voter records and sent them to Cambridge Analytica. CA claimed that these models were the heart of how they profiled you, your neuroses, and other exploitable traits. But Kogan and CA didn't stop there. His app also grabbed the personal data of your Facebook friends and compiled similar profiles of them. In just months, 270,000 people took Kogan's survey, and the data of up to 87 million friends was also harvested, close to 1/4 of all US Facebook users. CA then used that data to target people, maybe you, with political messaging. CA said this targeting helped the Trump campaign's strategy, but the campaign disputes this. Kogan's work claimed to be for academic research, but he also shared your information with Cambridge Analytica, a violation of Facebook's policies. So, was it a data breach? Facebook says no, that no passwords were stolen and no systems were infiltrated. But Mark Zuckerberg has said it was a breach of trust between Facebook and its users. The US Federal Trade Commission is investigating the case.
If you think this is an isolated case or an isolated example, think again, because there have been many examples of ethical issues in the past regarding data. If you're interested in learning more about this, I recommend checking out some of the links I provide here. Usually there are short YouTube videos that explain certain cases, such as the Equifax credit reports leak in 2017, and some other main data breaches that happened in 2019. And also more currently, there's the TED Radio Hour podcast on digital manipulation, which I highly recommend you listen to as well. Now, ethical issues aside, there are still other pros and cons to secondary data. The main advantages of secondary data are that the data is obtained very quickly, because basically all you need to do is search online, find the right databases and use that information. Since you don't have to collect your own primary data, the process becomes a lot faster. It's usually relatively inexpensive. Some databases can be very costly, but as long as you're a student at SDSU, you have access to tremendous amounts of resources that are usually very expensive, but as part of your tuition, you get those for free. Also, whatever the topic you're interested in studying, there's usually information available. So you'd be amazed at how much is already written about a variety of topics and is published online and widely accessible. Secondary data has an additional benefit that it can enhance primary data collection. If you do secondary data analysis first, it can give you insight into the problem you're studying, which can then refine and better target how you set your primary data analysis or research efforts. And in some cases, it can actually already achieve your research objectives. So sometimes no further steps, no further primary research is needed, simply because in many cases, secondary data just reaches the goal already. The main downsides of secondary data are that measurement units could be incompatible with what you're trying to measure. So let's say you want to find out more about American college students' housing situation, and all you find in secondary data is a split between either living in other housing, living with parent or guardian, and living on campus. So basically the categories of housing they use are not very granular, they're very broad. And if you need more detailed insight into what type of housing situations they live in, whether they live with roommates, how many roommates, and so on, then the secondary data may not be compatible with what you're looking for, or may not have that level of granularity that you're looking for. Sometimes secondary data is outdated. You might find studies that have been conducted in recent years, but a lot of situations, especially technology-related information, is quickly outdated. So always wonder how regularly has this information been updated. Census data, for example, US government census data, is only updated once every 10 years, so very rarely, so it's quickly outdated. Now there's other more frequent sources of information you can rely on besides census data, but definitely keep an eye on when that information was published. And then lastly, credibility of the source can be a major issue. So if you rely on secondary data, you have to investigate who's behind that secondary data. Who collected the information? Was there any conflict of interest? Was it a reliable, knowledgeable source of information? Can you actually trust the information, or should you go about collecting your own information so that you make sure that the quality is good? And this brings me to the next questions, 5 questions to evaluate the quality of secondary data. The first thing you want to ask when you're dealing with secondary data is, what was the purpose of the study? Was there any bias, any hidden intentions? Was there any conflict of interest? Who sponsored the study? This is of crucial importance because the intentions with which the study was carried out can gravely impact the findings or the way the study was conducted. There's many examples, and one particular one that I wanted to highlight is a discussion about sugar versus fat and coronary heart disease. Here's a quick video to illustrate this case.
You've probably heard that eating too much saturated fat can clog your arteries and lead to heart disease. But there is another potential culprit, sugar. New research published in the Journal of the American Medical Association suggests that the sugar industry paid Harvard scientists in the 1960s and 70s to downplay the link between heart disease and sugar. Instead, the scientists focus on saturated fat and cholesterol in meat and dairy products. At the time, medical journals did not require a disclosure of funding sources. Warnings about the harmful health consequences of fat have remained part of the government's dietary guidelines and have spurred low-fat diets. But now, scientists believe some fats, such as those found in fish and olive oil, have a role in a healthy diet. At the same time, sugar has recently begun to get more attention from the government. Earlier this year, for the first time, the USDA advised that added sugars should make up no more than 10% of caloric intake. And the FDA is mandating that food companies include added sugars in grams and as a percent of daily value on nutrition labels by 2018. The debate over sugar and its effect on our health is decades old, but it's come to the surface again recently. Joining us now is Dr. Laura Schmidt of the University of California. She co-authored a report showing that scientists were paid by the sugar industry in the 1960s to downplay sugar's negative impact on our health.
So this is not the only example of bias in research and conflict of interest. Another example is the Ask McDonald's campaign of a couple years ago, where they make use of a supposedly independent investigator.
McDonald's, makers of the world's most affordable heart disease. It's the restaurant whose logo represents the 2 massive spikes in blood pressure you'll experience after eating there. Well, they rolled out a bold new ad campaign this week called Our Food, Your Questions.
All right, McDonald's. What's with breakfast hours?
Does McDonald's even sell real food?
What part of the chicken is a chicken nugget?
What's in your chicken nugget?
That pink slime. What's up with that? How much do you care about the people that eat your food?
Okay, interesting technique. And to be fair, they're not just collecting questions from a recording device that makes you look like a vagrant getting into an argument with a poster. They're also answering them on their website and in a series of videos featuring a guy from Mythbusters.
I'm Grant Imahara, and I've spent years finding the truth. Now I'm going across America to find out how McDonald's makes its food. So ask your questions, and I'll find the answers.
Yeah, I've got a question. Why the fuck are you doing this? Please round up your answer to the nearest dollar. But I'm sorry. You were independently investigating the company paying you to conduct an independent investigation.
So you know what? I've been through the whole process. I know exactly what goes into this all-beef patty.
Yeah.
There's no fillers, no preservatives, no additives. It's all beef, and there's no pink slime. That's good.
Yeah? That's really good.
Nice.
There's something a little suspicious about the way they're celebrating the fact that their food is made out of food. But the questions people have about McDonald's go way beyond just their food. So yesterday we put our own McDonald's question board up here in New York City. Here are some of the results.
Hello? McDonald's?
What's up, McDonald's?
What's up, Mickey D's?
How the fuck does this pay stub for a single mother who's worked at a Chicago McDonald's for 7 years show that her take-home pay for more than 40 hours of work is only $292.52?
Is there somebody in there? Hello?
Why is my face like this?
Hello?
Am I a serial killer? Because I look like I could very easily be a serial killer.
Why are there currently 7 lawsuits against McDonald's and franchise operators alleging wage theft?
And why do these allegations include failure to pay overtime, forcing off-the-clock work, and engaging in a practice of managerial alteration of time records?
Please tell me this is cow blood. It's not. Stupid run! Stupid run!
So this example also underscores the importance of critical thinking when you deal with supposedly independent investigations or independent studies. So when you deal with secondary data, it's very important to look at the source of that data, the sponsor of the study, to truly know if the results are unbiased and reliable. A second question you must ask is who collected the information? What is their competence? What available resources did they have? Are they known in a specific industry? So basically, the more transparent an organization is about the data collection process, the more they tell you about their resources, what quality control measures they put in place, the more reliable that data will be. It's kind of like checking Yelp reviews before you get any service. You want to know what the satisfaction of previous clients was with that research firm. Third question you want to ask is what information was collected? So this has to do with that comparability of data that you want to use versus what's available. So maybe some studies you find claim to provide information on a general topic, but what they measured was in fact quite different. So sometimes there's an overestimation or underestimation of certain data, certain numbers, simply because they used a different way to measure it. So the way they counted, for example, bus riders versus amount of tokens used in public transportation can actually create a pretty big difference. Or when you want to focus on advertising effectiveness, how did another study measure advertising effectiveness? Did they measure it in terms of recall? Did they measure it in terms of behavior change? Did they measure it in terms of positive attitudes towards the ad? So basically, to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, you want to know exactly what information that the other study has collected to see if it truly translates or is useful for the study that you are trying to do. Next question is, how was the information obtained? And again, the rule of transparency is very important here. How was the information collected? What was the method they used? What was the sample size? And also, how much non-response was part of that sample size? What was the response rate? What was the information validated by any external entity, such as was it peer-reviewed? Was there any quality control, and so on? Overall, the more transparency, the better. Lastly, how consistent is the information you find in secondary data sources with other information you find in other secondary data sources? So basically, cross-comparing different organizations and their findings can give you a better idea of whether the information is truly reliable. Now, it rarely happens that different organizations report the exact same data, because there's always a margin of error. But if you're looking at certain demographic data, if you look at two different data sources, they should be reporting more or less the same percentages overall so that you know the data is reliable. So when you go about locating secondary data sources, the first step would be to identify what you want to know and what you already know. So it's kind of like making a grocery list. You know what's already in your fridge and you know what you still need, so you make a list. This is a very good approach to start in a very structured way, because once you dive into the big wonders of secondary data sources online, it's very easy to get overwhelmed. So I recommend writing down what the key topics are you want to investigate, maybe any key authors, any very important cases related to the topic you're investigating. So basically make a shopping list and then go find that information in a very structured way. Secondly, use different search strategies. And there's a lot of tips and tricks you could use when it comes to searching in an efficient way. So definitely make sure you use the correct terminology and use tons of synonyms. Keyword searching is best when you use different terminology, different synonyms to find the same concept. For example, if you're interested in finding data on the death penalty, you also want to use capital punishment as a potential synonym. Very important, because otherwise you limit yourself to only part of the available hits when there's probably a lot of publications using another description or another synonym for that same topic that you're otherwise missing out on. Other tips and tricks would be to use Boolean logic or and not, which allow you to maximize or limit your search to certain key terms. Field searching, so searching by author, title, subject, or date is really useful as well. You can use proximity operators such as adjacent, ADJ, or near, which allows you to, again, direct your search better. Truncation is another useful search strategy. It allows you to look at all possible endings of a word that start with the same stem or root of that word. For example, if you're looking at any technological developments, you could type in technolog and then put a little asterisk, and then it'll generate different outcomes of that same root of the word: technologies, technology, technological, and so on. Nesting is a technique that you can use to dictate a certain order in which a search has to be carried out. For example, if you're interested in finding information on Nike shoes, but also Nike clothes, you can use nesting as a way to direct your search. Limiting is another technique where you can limit your search to specific criteria, for example, date limitation. And this is especially useful if you only want more recent articles. A third step would be to compile the literature you found and then evaluate your findings. So do an intermediate check with yourself or with your research team, where you look at everything you have already and then start sifting through what is most relevant versus least relevant, evaluate what you have and what is still missing, so you can fill in the gaps of secondary data where needed. In this process, if you're looking for highly specialized data, don't hesitate to reach out to SDSU's librarians to recommend you any specialized sources. The next step would be to use an authority or ask an authority if needed. So let's say, for example, you find this really interesting article here about eco-friendliness and whether that is a masculine versus feminine stereotype, how that affects sustainable consumption. Let's say you want to read the whole article, but you only have access to the abstract. Then you can just email one of the authors, preferably the lead author. Email them and just say, hey, I'm a student conducting research in this area. I'm really interested in this article that you wrote that I came across. Would you mind sending me the full text? And in many cases, they will just be super helpful and reply pretty quickly, attaching the full PDF to the email. So usually it's pretty easy to get access to full academic articles that you otherwise may have to spend a lot of money on. The last step is reporting the results. So when you gathered all your secondary data, you've evaluated the quality of it, you've eliminated some based on quality or based on relevance, you compile all that information and you write a full report in which you summarize the main findings of that secondary data, how it can be used to enhance your primary data collection later on.